Okay, everyone, we're going to begin. Some people are still entering the room, but we'll let them do that as we get started. Welcome to the Clayman Institute for Gender Research's Clayman Conversations series, a program that convenes feminist leaders who are driving timely conversations in their fields. I'm Dr. Angelica Ferrara, and I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the Institute. And I first want to note to our audience that this event is being recorded. And after the call, we will circulate an email with any resources mentioned today so that our conversation can be ongoing. Today, we are welcoming three exceptionally experienced, devoted experts on masculinity and men. And I'm going to start by telling you who is in the room, starting with myself. I am a developmental and social psychologist at Stanford University's Clayman Institute. My research investigates how stereotypes and norms come to shape core human development competencies, specifically social and emotional development in children and adults. My focus right now is on men's friendships, and my book, Men Without Men, is investigating how certain masculine norms impede men's development of close bonds, but how strengthening those bonds among men can reduce the emotional burden on women and ultimately further gender equality. I'm going to start introducing our panelists, starting with Dr. Tristan Bridges. He is a professor of sociology and faculty affiliate of feminist studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is co-editor of the Sage journal Men and Masculinities and interim director of an interdisciplinary center at UCSB focused on public-facing scholarship. Bridges' research examines issues of gender and sexuality, inequality, and change. He has studied communities of bodybuilders, fathers' rights activists, pro-feminist men, men with man caves in their homes, connections between American masculinity and mass shootings, gender transformation in US sexual demography, and gendered patterns in internet searches. His work has appeared in Gender and Society, Signs, The Lancet, the International Review of Sociology, and other venues. Christine Emba is a journalist, most recently at The Atlantic, where her work ranges widely, exploring questions of gender, relationships, and the moral economy. Previously, she was an opinion columnist, editor, and editorial board member at The Washington Post, where she wrote the essay, Men Are Lost, and many of us in the room are familiar with that essay. Earlier in her career, Emba was the Hilton Kramer Fellow in Criticism at the New Criterion and a deputy editor at The Economist Intelligence Unit, focusing on technology and innovation. Emba was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers by Prospect Magazine in 2022 and received the National Press Club's Nell Minow Award for Cultural Criticism in 2023. Her first book, Rethinking Sex, A Provocation, is about the failures and potential of the sexual revolution in a post-Me Too world. Emba is also a board member at the American Institute for Boys and Men. Finally, Dr. Tavishi Gupta is the Director of Research, Evaluation, and Learning at Equimundo. Her expertise lies in understanding the role of gender norms in perpetuating violence against women and children, creating inequitable home and workplace environments, and reinforcing intergenerational transmission of harmful gender identities for boys and girls. She is part of the Lancet Commission's Scientific Advisory Committee on Child Maltreatment and Violence Prevention, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Embracing Carers Group, and has been invited to join the advisory for the OECD Technical Group on Masculinities, the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report, and more. Before joining Equimundo, Gupta worked as an independent consultant with the Overseas Development Institute, UNICEF Rosa, Plan International, and Harvard's Kennedy School. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. Many of those in the audience today are aware and join this event because they are making sense of what men are experiencing in the world right now, either as men and boys themselves or as those who care deeply about men and boys. We have heard commentary on the left, on the right, and in the center that positions men's struggles in education, wages, mental health, and close relationships as evidence that men and boys across the global north are lost. We know that many young boys' attitudes about the importance of traditional masculine norms of dominance and aggression and risk-taking are at levels that are often higher than their fathers and their grandfathers. At this moment, we think it's important to come together and ask, what is real and what is imaginary about the crisis of masculinity? And importantly, what should we do as people, as practitioners, clinicians, parents, and feminists who want to seize upon a moment of what is arguably great gender flux in a way that rebuilds a more gender equitable world? Our first question to start us off, I'm going to ask to Tristan. Tristan, a range of highly visible pundits and politicians, podcasters, and celebrities have helped create an idea that men are, as an entire gender, in crisis. So we see things like Jerry Seinfeld saying that he misses real men, right-wing politicians and influencers talking about how real men should vote, and even academics saying that men are missing role models. Voices from all corners of culture seem to have something to say. To begin, what is real and what is imagined about this proposed crisis? And our other panelists can join in whenever they wish.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction to all of us. I'm really excited to be on the panel. The crisis of masculinity is a really compelling story. And that is often, I think, a really productive way of starting the conversation is calling it what it is. I think that it's a story, and every time it's presented, it sounds like a very new story, but scholars who have studied this know that it's a story that's at least 200 years old. And so often when I teach undergraduate students about the quote unquote crisis of masculinity, I think it proceeds from an assumption that masculinity is one thing, and that one thing has sort of been disrupted in a historically unprecedented way. But scholars who study masculinity know that masculinity was never one thing. And so because it's kind of always on the move, it's really hard to call in crisis, because crisis sort of requires some prior period of stability. And the thing we know about masculinity is it lacks those periods. It doesn't mean that something unusual is happening right now. It just means that people find the story really compelling. And I think we have to be careful in asking, that doesn't mean it's true. It just means that it's a story that gets us excited and thinking about things.
Yeah, I mean, well, sorry, Christine speaking here. I will jump in and note that I am perhaps one of the pundits responsible for some of this crisis narrative. And first of all, I want to say that Tristan makes an incredibly important point that masculinity has always been shifting, that if, we want to talk about sectors of society that are in crisis, in some sense, one could say that almost everybody is in a crisis of some sort. But I do think that there is real reason in this moment why at least the framing of masculinity or men being in crisis really resonates with, my readers, with politicians, with members of society who are worried about this. I mean, we know that we are in a moment in which norms are in flux, in which, even gender is in flux. And that is incredibly liberating, but can also be incredibly, scary and destabilizing for a number of different groups. And although it's very easy to sort of not be sympathetic to men and to note, as one should, that they have generally been in positions of power in society, even, spanning time, I think that it is fair to note that our particular moment is a pretty specific one. If we just look at the past, say, half century, deindustrialization, automation, free trade, and peacetime have shifted labor markets dramatically and not in men's favor. So when we talk about the groups that have seen, the biggest drops in employment recently, it is men, and especially working age men, who are completely detaching from the labor market. And men in a job, especially again, working class men, have seen their wages stagnate. And, whether the entire gender of men is struggling or not, it's fair to say that those experiencing this in this moment will probably acknowledge that that is a startling statistic, and not a positive sign for men today. I mean, we can also observe simply in the statistics that, men are beginning to fall behind in education, both in at the far end of education in the achievement of bachelor's degrees, further education, but also even early in education. Boys are quick to fall behind uh, in kindergarten, in elementary school learning. And, if we care about our society being well educated, noting that the specific group that is boys is struggling in our school system, that does seem to be, a crisis. I mean, another sign that I think that differs from the past, that is worth being aware of, is the sort of mental health and loneliness implications. The US Surgeon General has pointed out that loneliness is, a society-wide crisis at this point. So it is one for all of us. But if you look at the statistics, it's men specifically who account for almost 3 out of 4 deaths of despair in the United States, meaning either from suicide, alcohol abuse, or an overdose. That is specific to men, and that is something that we should be concerned about. I mean, I think it's, again, just to recap, I think it's incredibly fair to note and necessary to note that sort of definitions of the self, including masculinity, are always in flux. But I do think that this is a unique moment for men in the global north and men in the United States.
And I won't add more stats, because thank you, Christine, for sharing that evidence. But I think it's also just building on what both Tristan and Christine said. I think we also need to look at it as masculinity as a power system, as a power differential. And that is a crisis. It has always been in crisis, which is what Tristan was also kind of alluding to. It is the patriarchy by itself is inherently in crisis. And we need to understand that, because what it does is it creates a binary. It does create oppression. And it creates also harmful outcomes and impacts for the person who's supposed to be in power. No one is ever going to be alpha male enough. No one's ever going to earn enough. It has created. So I think we also need to understand that sometimes it acts at the individual level, the crisis, but sometimes when we're saying crisis of masculinity, we are talking at a much larger macro systems level, where we're saying the power differential is in crisis. It's an incredible thing. When I was working in my doctoral program, there was this understanding and revelation that there's so many scripts for young girls and for parents to be able to sort of teach young girls, how do you actually overcome the norms of sort of, femininity, and don't be too, you should be standing up for yourself, and you should be assertive, and you can reach for the stars and do anything you want. And there was a lot of conversation around these scripts existing for daughters, but none really for sons. And what kind of became really clear very quickly was, we're raising girls to be like boys, and then we're raising boys to be like boys. And so the values that we're attaching to what we're calling assertive for girls are what is known as aggressive in boys. What we call standing up for, yourself is what we say boys are always ready for a fight, right? So we as a society continue to value these traits that are deeply, deeply masculine. And so until we don't step away and say, let's try to find a way where we can also shift away from this binary discourse, I'm not sure we can actually ever get away from this crisis conversation.
Thank you, Tavishi. I think you are all pointing to a couple different levels of this discussion that we don't often see broken down when we hear or are exposed to this idea of a crisis of masculinity. It sounds like on one level, we're talking about individuals, right, who feel generally unmoored at this particular time, or particularly young boys who are vulnerable to someone saying, hey, I have the answer for how men and boys should act. This level of the individual. And then we have these levels of scripts about what should boys and men be told to act like? And do they need those scripts? Are we in a moment where those can be abandoned, or should they be recreated? And then we're speaking about changes at the level of the system. Christine, as you're calling in these huge sort of mega cultural changes across time that are destabilizing the established roles that men have embodied for quite a long period of time. So I want to ask, what do we really mean by masculinity? Just to give us some terminology and operationalize those terms. When we say masculinity, are we talking about how any boy or man acts? Are we talking about the values in society that we hold to be masculine? So when we hear this term out there, what should we be thinking it's referring to? And I'll let you start, Tavishi, if you want to jump in on that. I know your work specifically calls to not a center of speaking about masculinity, but Equimundo works on masculinities plural.
Yeah, it does indeed. And I think what you were saying, I would say all of it. So when we think about masculinities, it's a socially constructed phenomena. And it's a set of rules that are socially constructed, expectations, attitudes, beliefs, prescriptions that is expected of everyone. It's what I was saying just earlier, which is we often think that it's sort of only something that we need from boys and men, but actually girls and women and people of all genders actually are living in this larger expectation of what it means to be masculine, precisely because we are valuing all the things that the patriarchy says should be typically assigned to boys and men, right? So we feminize things like care and emotional vulnerability, and we sort of really put a lot of value to individualism and to being able to sort of do work on your own without the help you need. These are all a set of beliefs and attitudes, and then they get enacted upon in day-to-day in terms of behaviors. So I think I would sort of step back and simply say masculinities, and they look different across different societies, context, groups of people, and they create power differentials between them. But they're socially constructed rules, expectations, and prescriptions that are expected of everyone.
I can jump in to add to that. I think that when we last spoke, one way of thinking about masculinity is also thinking about it as a status. And I like teaching and thinking about it as a status because I think it helps you understand that it is socially constructed, but it also keeps power and inequality kind of center in the conversation. The thing about status is that you can only have it if somebody else doesn't. And masculinity has that quality. You can't do it alone. It's something that has to be enacted in groups, and that it's this sort of valuation. One of the fun parts about studying masculinity is just how slippery the term is. So if we had a historian on this call, they might laugh at us because historically masculinity is like a pretty young term, actually. But even in its youth, it's changed radically in terms of what it means. And as we've tried to put questions on surveys to kind of assess the masculinity of different people in all sorts of different societies, we've discovered that it's just notoriously difficult to measure.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just jump in for a final note on this too. I think that's fascinating, Tristan, actually, what you just said. That's really useful. This idea that masculinity can't be enacted alone. And I think that's a helpful clarification too. I think when I think about the phrases that I use to talk about this issue, men are in crisis, masculinity is in crisis, and I've used those kind of interchangeably, it is worth thinking about what exactly we're saying. And I think when we talk about masculinity in crisis, this is exactly what we're talking about. The concept of masculinity, the sort of stability or lack of stability in the norm of masculinity, kind of the emotions that people who are interested in these topics of gender or their experience of gender feel about sort of the concept of masculinity. One could say that that's in a crisis because it is very confusing, and feels like it has become, for various reasons, even more pressingly confusing in this moment, but also has been in crisis over time, kind of for all time. But I think also, you know, you can, and again, this refers back to our last question too, when talking about men in crisis, and I think at least on this panel too, if it's a helpful clarification, I do think that we are talking about sort of the physical reality of sort of men as a sexed or gendered group, you know, especially, but not only limited to, but I think especially in the global north, in North America. I know I focus on the United States, but we're seeing sort of these issues with men, whether labor market stagnation, deaths of despair, alarming reaction to feminism as a result of destabilization, also kind of across a wide range of sort of leading OECD countries right now, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, but I think especially in the United States too.
Thank you, Christine. I think your point is a really astute one. This idea that like there is a lot of confusion about what we mean by this idea, and Tristan, this notion of a slippery concept. I wonder if part of the reason why it's so slippery is because we are referring to half the people, or around half the people on this planet, with a term that tries to encapsulate ways of being for half the people who are walking through the world. And so we often use masculinity as this term to talk about just, general ways that men are, or are thought to be, or are prescribed to be. But I wonder if we can get even more specific in thinking about who this crisis is about. Because when we say the crisis is men as an entire gender, I wonder what we're missing. I wonder if there are particular groups that distracts us from seeing. And we speak of men as a monolith in a way that, frankly, if I were to hear about the state of women, I might be just a little puzzled. It might really give me pause. So I'm wondering why we talk that way. What are the failures of just grouping men in this way, and what are we missing? And whoever wants to jump in, please.
I can give a short start, and I would love Christine and Tristan to jump in as well. I mean, I think just right off the bat, I think there is an imbalance in even the evidence and data that exists just by virtue of where resources are, there's inequities in sort of training and facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So already I can say that, as you were, Christine, already mentioning, there's tremendous amounts of data that are coming out from like the global north, the US, but even within that, I think that we tend to sort of focus predominantly on like heterosexual, cisgender men from, the majority ethnic groups in Western contexts, essentially. And I really like your question of sort of, like, what is it that we overlook when we sort of put men in this one larger category? And I think that the diversity of masculinities, right, is something that we are now missing out on, because we are, first of all, ignoring, or not, and probably not intentionally, but we are not intentionally bringing in the nuances and the variations that exist across different groups, not just ethnicity wise. We have research from our International Men and Gender Equality Survey that's now taken place in 50 plus countries. And we find that men in lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to experience stress because of the provider role. And so these kind of nuances become really important to then bring into the conversation when we talk about men in general, because then the solutions that we bring in are varied across groups as well. Another sort of thing that I think we miss often is sort of the recognition of ongoing gender inequalities. When we focus only on sort of this idea of crisis for men, sometimes, and it can have a tendency to do that, we overshadow the persistent areas where men do hold disproportionate power and privilege. So we need to be able to hold both conversations at the same time. I know, Tristan, you had mentioned this once in our call. We say this a lot in our Equimundo. It's this and approach. It's being able to say, women and men, like, and we can sit in that discomfort, I think, of that we're all sort of, we physically kind of feel that, but it's true, and we should be able to engage in that conversation. And the last thing I want to say is that, like, what is it that we gain from it? I want to sort of highlight that when we talk about this crisis framing, perhaps it also can give us a space to say there could be loss and threat. And are there ways in which we can sort of think about opportunities where we can create change? And perhaps that flux conversation then comes in and becomes even more important, that when we're saying something's in crisis, maybe that's the time in which that little sliver of, space we get is where change can happen. I'll stop here.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say again, like, excellent points. And I think I just want to highlight again this point that you just made, Species, that I think is so core. We can talk about, men or masculinity being in crisis, but we have to again and again acknowledge that this isn't a zero-sum game. And that, as I like to say, kind of sadly, when looking at the news, we live in a society, and men interact with women, who interact with their families, their communities, with everyone else in society. So if one group, which is to say men, are struggling or in crisis, that also kind of necessarily means that the rest of us will be facing a crisis soon, because we remain interrelated. And so we can't segregate this idea of men in crisis as sort of this, one outgroup that we're talking about in a vacuum. I also want to highlight, I mean, I think about this a lot in my work as a journalist and speaking publicly. It is, again, narratives like X group is in crisis, written in bold font, are very sort of easy to talk about. They're simplified explanations, but they do leave out a lot of nuance. And when we talk about men or masculinity being in crisis, it is really important to note, as Angelica, I think, is trying to pull out here very helpfully, that certain groups are struggling more than others. What crisis looks like in different communities, is very different. I think it's definitely worth acknowledging still that, upper middle class, wealthy, heterosexual, white, whatever normative, men in the United States are like still doing pretty well. I think it's fair that we can acknowledge that kind of on a broad scale, at least financially, status wise. They're doing okay. But where we see, statistically, issues with deaths of despair, wage stagnation, job loss, is especially, although not only, in working class groups of men. And that is an area that sometimes gets kind of lumped in with men in general. And that's, I think that is like a group where we're seeing sort of a material crisis in terms of job loss, education loss, wages, etc. I think, though, that there is also kind of an immaterial crisis that we talk about, of sort of stability, norms, meaning. And one of the groups where we see that a lot is, I think, younger men, especially, who are trying to figure out their role in the world. And in my reporting, for this essay I wrote, for other pieces, I tend to spend a good amount of time just talking to men, talking to young men, talking to older men. And one of the reasons why I still feel comfortable saying that this is, or speaking in the language of crisis, is when talking to like specific groups. And I would say that actually young men, kind of under 30, or teenagers, are a very specific group where, even if they're not experiencing a financial crisis of some kind, they are very visibly to themselves and to me often experiencing sort of emotional crises and crises of meaning, and understanding where they fit in the world and how they should be. And that might not be something that's easily reflected in the statistical data, but if you have kind of a large group of individuals having kind of a crisis of self, I think you can say that masculinity is in crisis in a specific sense there too. And then tagging back, sorry, to the material experience of the crisis, the other group that I think is worth pulling out in this equation is Black men, who, when we talk about sort of a crisis of masculinity, and who is losing jobs, whose wages are stagnating the most, who is falling behind the most in terms of education, it's often men of color, and especially Black men. And if we want to kind of parse out different groups and how different groups are being affected, it's worth parsing out, this group as well.
It's hard to go last because everyone says everything. I think the one thing that I think is worth kind of noting in this conversation is that I think that the easiest way of having this conversation is sort of asking, so does masculinity help or does it hurt? And sometimes people get pitted and said, so which side are you on there? And the challenging thing about systems of inequality is that like often they're doing both of those things at the same time. So just to give an example from education, for instance, it is absolutely true that boys and young men are really falling behind in school. They have lower rates of achievement in the United States, but in lots of countries measured all around the world, they're more likely to drop out, fail out, flunk out, be kicked out of school than are girls. But they're also more likely to be at the top of their class. Um, and sort of both of those things are true. And I think masculinity scholars would say the weird thing about masculinity is that it's probably partially to blame for both of those outcomes. It's like helping some and hurting others. And then the other thing that I would say is I'm glad that we're bringing up the sort of diverse ways that men are sort of bumping into this crisis and the connection between masculinity and wage labor. That is a problematic framework that is impacting men all around the world. And boys and young men are scared about that they're not going to be able to live up to this ideal. Economies are changing that are making it less possible. And it's actually men on the margins who are creating new ways of being that might actually allow us to kind of open this up. I know Tavishi was talking about this on the last call that in the US, and maybe you were speaking about another country as well, it's like men of color who are in heterosexual relationships who are like leaning into flexible arrangements with their partner so that both people are able to make some income and participate in childcare. They're more involved fathers. And so it's not only that that group is lacking access to that provider role, but through lacking that access, they're inventing new ways of being so that it may be that they're experiencing the crisis, but they're also inventing resolutions that maybe the rest of us should be taking note of.
Hmm. I want to note some of my past work focused on men who were involved in culturally feminized work. And one of the biggest missing narratives that I found was that those who are leading this call to get more men involved in nursing, early childhood education, domestic care were men of color and specifically Black men. But when we say men aren't doing these jobs, well, actually, some men are doing these jobs. We have a lot to learn from them. But I think this is a good point to bring in something you said in our last call, Tristan, of gender vertigo. This concept comes from Barbara Risman, the esteemed sociologist, which is about the moments of flux and change in ideas about what gender is. And I think a lot of us are pointing to that and having this discussion about, well, do norms help or do they hurt? Or perhaps is it both at the same time? I've personally been struggling to know how to deal with this question because in one sense, what feminism has given me, I think I've shared this quote in the past, Judith Butler says that feminism asks the question of what is a woman and refuses to answer it, right? There is a proliferation of acceptable identities for women to have that have been available for me to choose because of my exposure and upbringing with feminism. I know that many of the men in my life do not feel that same sense of freedom and that there are fewer acceptable options to choose from. And many of these podcasters or politicians give men two options, which are alpha or beta, right? You're either sort of a masculine guy or you're a guy who's subordinated and made to be a second class, which is to say like a woman. So do we need a proliferation of masculine norms in society, or perhaps do we need to question the perpetual reinvention of masculinity over and over again, as we have seen through the ages? And again, I do wish we had a historian on this panel to tell us about the amount of times that concept has been perceived as in deep crisis and in need of reinvention. So what is the usefulness of masculine norms? Where should we hold on and where should we let go?
I can start this one. So gender vertigo, I think, is a really helpful concept. And Barbara Risman is a brilliant sociologist and published a book with that title. She borrowed it actually from Australian gender theorist Raewyn Connell. And the idea originally, Raewyn writes about it, and she says that, I mean, the tough thing about systems of inequality is they require buy-in. They have to be legitimated to kind of work. And systems of inequality are kind of always going to be open to challenge and question. People don't like unfairness. And when unfairness is pointed out, some people will rise up to do something about it. Gender vertigo was her way of sort of talking about these historical moments when notions of gender were in flux, when systems of inequality were openly challenged. And she argues in the book, I think she originally coined it in, it's called Gender and Power. And the argument is basically that there's a lot of progressive potential inside of those historical moments where people are a little bit less certain about what masculinity or femininity or gender norms actually might look like. But these are also periods that we can absolutely go backwards. And so we see these reactionary things happening as well. And the other thing that I wanted to say that sort of I was thinking about earlier is one thing that I think is very unique about this current moment. Like Christine has been talking a lot about something feels electric and unique, and something really big is happening with this sort of contemporary notion of masculinity in crisis. And I think it has to do with a larger notion of privilege that has just sort of been world historically challenged in new ways in recent history. And it's not just gender privilege, it's like every form of privilege that you can imagine. White privilege, heterosexual privilege, able-bodied privilege, education privilege. Like privilege has kind of become a dirty word. And it doesn't make it go away for us to label it, but it feels like it has never been more visible than it is today. And that is, I think, different groups of people are kind of navigating how that feels. It doesn't stop you from benefiting from privilege, but it absolutely alters the experience of privilege if it stops being as invisible as it once was to the people who benefit the most. And I feel like that's what we're living through right now. And the crisis of masculinity question, I think you could equally have a panel on the crisis of heterosexuality or the crisis of whiteness or all of these privileged identities. I think people are kind of navigating what does it look like when your privilege is out in the open.
Yeah, I like that you're framing this with a really positive vision, Tristan, because I think, and I seeing this in the Q&A reflected too, that the idea of like framing it as a crisis of masculinity makes it sound very bad and very dire. And there are very bad and dire things that feel like they're happening to men in terms of, material loss, wages, et cetera, et cetera. But crises are also catalysts. And the crisis could be like a really positive space and moment to reinvent norms, to reconsider norms that no longer serve us, to finally make our understanding of masculinity corrigible on a societal level, to the benefit of the next men who will be forced to define themselves in certain ways, but who, as women, are finally enjoying, as you put it, Angelica, this profusion of options, profusion of roles that they can exist in, that maybe men will actually be allowed to break out of the privileged but actually quite small box of roles that they have kind of been forced to pick from. But that said, I also want to make a point in favor of norms, just norms kind of more broadly, whether it is a norm of masculinity that young men are, given to live up to, or some sort of like understanding of like, this is like the basic outline of what being an adult man looks like in the United States. I think it's, again, fair to say and recognize that norms can be really restrictive, that I think we push back, and many men have pushed back against the norm or box of masculinity because they want something outside of that box and they feel, restricted by that norm. But again, in talking to young men, and to men without, as many resources as I think many of us, all the members of this panel certainly, but even those in the audience might have, norms can actually be helpful in structuring one's life and allowing psychic and social stability. So I guess to make this more concrete, the norm of man or masculinity can certainly be restrictive. And I think all of us as adults, who are, I think, on average, like well-educated and probably better educated than the, average American, who have professional careers, and live in places, I think, and with the freedom as, adults of age to sort of define ourselves, can create our own norms. Finally, we can look with a distance at past norms and reinvent our own norms of masculinity or anything else, and have the resources to do that, have the resources and privilege to be able to recreate that ourselves. But I think for, a much larger, I think, number of people and men in our society than we are often called to reflect upon, whether it's simply young men, teenagers who are just trying to figure out how to move about in a confusing world, whether it's men who feel restricted to certain groups and need to, find their place before they have gotten the resources to sort of reinvent themselves in the way that, many of us have. Having a norm, whether it's of masculinity or anything else, a structure by which you can at least have some idea of what direction you're moving in or what you want to aspire to be until you have had the time and resources to create your own definition, is an important part of the scaffolding of life. Is something that actually allows people to survive and find ways to move about in the world. And I think that, it is very easy to say, well, masculinity is in crisis, but it was a bad norm anyways, and we should toss that out and let people decide for themselves. I think everybody wants to be able to decide for themselves, but actually having a positive vision, or at least something in place that I think helps especially younger people and less resourced people find paths to move through the world, still is valuable. And so we should also work to make whatever norm we have left as engaging, as corrigible, as positive, but frankly visible for those who need it as we can.
Thank you, Christine. I think this is also an important point to bring in Tavishi, because Tavishi, one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot is whether norms should be gendered, or whether there should be, whether guiding roles for what humans should generally possess are enough of a guideline for people. And I'm wondering where that strikes you.
Yeah, and I alluded to this earlier, right? So there's this incredible work by Sarah Hrdy. The book is called Mothers and Others. And in that, sort of, she has sort of highlighted that the reason why we as a human species have survived, right, as Homo sapiens versus any other species, is predominantly because of our ability to have empathy and care and connection. And over the years and decades and centuries, we have sort of taken that, what should have been a human level norm, and completely gendered it, right, essentially. And so now we have this, in the development sector where I work, we have a lot of sort of research on like unpaid care work, and how women all over the world are disproportionately doing more unpaid care work than men are. And that we actually could put back trillions of dollars back into countries' GDPs and global GDP if we're able to compensate women for their unpaid care work. So we've basically taken something that is so natural, normal, and allowed us to survive, essentially, and sort of gendered it. Now, I liked one point that Christine made, which is sort of, are norms important? And I think they are certainly important. And I think that we need to recognize the power that norms have in young people's lives today. So I'll give you two sort of, data points and like research evidence that we've sort of done that can show to you how we need to really understand and tackle what this norms in a very thoughtful way, but also with that positive affirmation that I think, Tristan, you were bringing in as well. So one is that our images study, the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, we had data in 33 countries, and we asked young men, middle-aged men and older men to give us their responses on gender attitudes. And the gender attitudes are things like, women should be in charge of changing diapers, there's acceptability of violence against women, and there's, men should be the ones who make decisions in the household. And this is, as I mentioned, across 33 countries. So we wanted to make sure that there's also contextualization that can happen across countries. And what we found when we did the analysis across these 33 countries was a very interesting pattern. We saw that men between the ages of 18 to 29 held the same level of restrictive attitudes as men of the age of 50 plus. So it was sort of this like inverted U pattern. And that's deeply concerning. And so that's one piece of evidence that I wanted to share. And the other piece of evidence I want to share is that we, in the United States, did this study along with a partner where we did like digital scraping, AI analysis of Twitch streams, Discord chat logs, 100 hours of observations, seeing sort of male-dominated channels. And Angelica, you referred to this a little bit, right? So it's this idea of the manosphere. And what has happened is when you take this norm, right, this like norm about being men, because as you mentioned, there's only two ways of being, the manosphere has successfully leveraged male pain points and digital spaces and sort of found this way to create strategic messaging that speaks to young men's lived challenges. So when we did an analysis, we found that they speak to three main vulnerabilities. One is men are isolated and they want to belong to a community. And the second is that men are thirsty for definitions of success and a roadmap to get there. And the third is that men who feel rejected or have experienced failure in their own relationships with women are sort of getting attracted to this space. And I think, again, this idea, why I sort of talk about, the whether there should be gender or whether the norm should be sort of at human level, I want to sort of say that all these online influencers are using the same strategies that we at development sector use to actually change and bring about positive change. We call it gender transformative programmatic approaches. GTA work, it takes place all over the world where we actually bring men and women into the room, couples, we actually talk to them about power and privilege. We have success in countries like Rwanda and more, where we're saying that like when you start making men critically aware of the ways in which power and privilege, and then therefore the norms that they're expected to adhere to harms them and their families, there are spaces for change that we're talking about. Yet these online influencers use the exact same tactics, right? To say, let me tell you about power and privilege. They just flip it. So I think that we have such a responsibility to think about these norms in this kind of critical way and recognize that, one, it's the young men who are getting most attracted to these harmful norms. And that, so I think for me, the question is less about gendering, but more about sort of like, how do we thoughtfully engage in tackling these norms that are very rigid for men particularly?
I find some of that information, Tavishi, just stunning and so deeply concerning. And I know that we have a range of the amount of years of experience that the four of us have. But for me, in my career of 7 or 8 years, this is the first time that I'm really confronting this idea that, wow, we're seeing either equal or more harmful visions of masculinity promoted among young men, and an incredibly effective algorithmic radicalization that gets this message out much faster than nonprofits, academics, book sales, who's buying books, not the people that are exposed to the same materials. So this conversation is very, very electric and urgent. And I think it's so important for us to talk about young men, and I'm already seeing in the Q&A, and please, for those who don't know, the Q&A is there, please feel free to put your questions in, because we'll start answering them in about 10 minutes. Are there particular ways that you would like to see us move forward in approaching young men, in involving young men in this conversation in ways that, Christine, you said in our last call so beautifully that that certain people in the manosphere are offering young men a hand that is coming up from the water, and they'll grab the first one that's there, right? So how do we offer another hand? And how would you like to see this change take place? I know it's a hard question.
Yeah, yeah, no, that really is the question at the end of all of these panels and discussions, like not just what is happening, but like what's next? What can we do to help? And yeah, Angelica was citing a metaphor that I've used before, that I've talked about in different work on masculinity, that, you know, these men who feel, you know, whether it's true or not that they're in crisis, are just casting about for help, for sympathy, for some recognition from someone, some vision of masculinity to live up to. And right now, unfortunately, it does feel to many of them, even though this is not accurate, and perhaps because of, you know, these algorithmic structures that push forward certain loud voices and not, you know, more considered takes, as it were, that these manosphere influencers, the Andrew Tates, etc., are the only ones offering them help, and no one else is offering help. And if someone is desperate for a new vision, desperate for a hand, they will take whatever is offered. And in absence of a different positive vision, or more considered norm, or better resources from, you know, a more considered side, if Andrew Tate is the first thing available, they're going to go with Andrew Tate. So it really is up to us to begin to create that positive vision that can be as, or hopefully more attractive than the negative visions that they're of masculinity that young men especially, and troubled men more generally, are being drawn to. I mean, just Tavishi, what you were saying, your sort of middle point of evidence that you guys found, that a lot of men are just simply looking for a definition of success, like they don't even know what it is, but they just want someone to tell them how to succeed and want a roadmap to get there. We need to find better ways to give them better roadmaps first before they attach themselves to these really ugly roadmaps that we're seeing in media, in politics, and elsewhere. And so I think to that point, and I think someone brought this up in the comment section as well, or in the Q&A section, one of the first places to start is by, again, providing in media, in sort of the public sphere, not just in academia, but in, like, you know, popular TV shows, in books and movies, in political discussions, alternate and celebrated visions for what masculinity could look like and what men can be. In my research, you know, talking to men, a number of them brought up that, well, you know, when you see masculinity or see men depicted on TV, it's either just sort of like a bumbling dad figure that is not aspirational, that nobody wants to be, or you hear masculinity derided as toxic, and that's sort of the first thing that's said about men. And so I guess, like, I'm a toxic person. That's the only option I have. So maybe actually these places of visibility in media, in politics, are where we can find, again, this multiplicity, many versions, but like positive visions of masculinity, and actually present them so that they look like options to men living in the world. I mean, in our political moment right now, I found it really interesting looking at the contrasting versions of masculinity that are on offer from our two, you know, political parties, and have been sort of heartened to see even just slightly different versions of masculinity offered in, you know, The First Gentleman, or you know, in Tim Waltz, that just look different from perhaps the older versions of masculinity, but are actually being celebrated in a positive way. So I think I think there is so much room for study, so much room for statistics, but to affect people on the ground, in the real world, in their day-to-day lives, we need to pay a lot of attention to the visions that are being projected to them and begin to update those.
I can say I'm still sort of on the fence of whether the way to bring boys and men in is with discourses on masculinity or not. I think there's so much feminist work that talks about, you know, various ways that masculinity is a problem, but then it's also something that is offered as solution. So I'm sure everyone on this call has been invited to be a part of positive masculinity weeks or healthy masculinity events or etc. And I think masculinity scholars are often called upon to kind of like diagnose the various masculinities of people and say some are helpful, others aren't. And part of me wonders if masculinity is really the answer. If it's a status, and if status requires you being more powerful and privileged than others, then maybe the way to the sort of move forward is to talk about what it costs people to achieve it. I don't know that we need to, you know, I think so much public programming is spent trying to help men man up to like different versions of masculinity. And I just am not sure that this is a productive direction. I think we try to get men into care work this way. We try to get men to be more aware of gender and sexual violence and power using this tactic. And I just don't know that it is possible that it can be both problem and solution. Like, I think part of the solution has to be identifying what it costs men to try to live up to this. And that hopefully, in seeing that and in recognizing their full humanity and the relationships that it gives them access to, that we can start to see a path forward. But I don't know that finding a new way to repackage masculinity is going to lead to the change that all of us hope.
I want to jump in really quickly there, to maybe complicate that a little bit. I think you're right that we can't redefine masculinity well by being like, here's the other masculinity, the same as the old masculinity, but I don't know, cuter in some way or something. But I also think that, you know, as ideas people, as academics, as thinkers, it's really, we want to envision sort of the utopian world, the sort of end game. Where we want to go perhaps is to really remake the whole sort of like vision of masculinity into something else. And that is our end goal. But much as I was saying with kind of the discussion on norms, we also, I think, need to be a little bit practical here. And it is worth thinking about how to best bridge ourselves from the current norms of masculinity to that other thing. And I think it can be sort of jarring and annoying to note that, like, we're sort of pointing to an old hegemonic vision of masculinity to try and train men into something else. Like, it's a little bit of a frustrating proposition, but just, you know, thinking about the way that people in real life operate, it may be a lot to ask in this societal moment to say, well, we're going to go directly from the old masculinity to something brand new and as yet unimagined. But maybe the way to bring people along is first introduce them to perhaps maybe it's new masculinity, new masculinities that reference the old but are better, and that then allow in themselves an opening up to something that doesn't address the old, maybe actually addresses something new. But this will be, you know, a step-by-step process, I think. You know, saying that, well, we can't, that men should, you know, we should just abandon the idea of masculinity and just like start learning this entirely new thing. I make the analogy to, again, because I'm thinking about sort of like material and working realities here. The idea that, you know, when we felt that we were going to have a wholesale economic change, you know, well, why don't we just tell the coal miners to stop coal mining and learn to code? that'll be really easy for them. Just like switch over now. And as we look back, like that was clearly not a realistic proposition. And that's why it didn't work. And that has engendered a lot of resentment. And so I think that we need to think about realistic and plausible ways to move from one to the next. You know, Angelica is talking about how feminism opened these new doors and new visions of womanhood. But we also have to note that that has taken a long time and is in fact still in process. And it very much has been not like, well, let's abandon the concept of femaleness or womanhood altogether. But it was sort of like, oh, even women, first it was simply like, even women can do these roles too. It's normal for women to do these roles too. These are just roles. They are not just for women. And it takes this continual evolution. And I think we just need to recognize that if we want to actually make real change in the real world.
I'll add a couple of sentences. I know we're at time, but you know, both Christine and Tristan have said so much. Couple of things I think is that I think and our research shows this, right? Men who have the most traditional views around manhood, we do a study called Man Box. They actually also have the highest purpose in life, sort of sense of purpose in life, which is just such a difficult finding for us to reconcile with. But I think what that shows is how sort of, you know, the script that I was mentioning, right, around sort of these hyper-masculine masculinities is so much more clearer and so much more palpable, and everything else, the alternatives that Christine, you're talking about, which is true, it's confusing, it's abstract, it feels unattainable. And therefore, right, I think that sort of desire to go towards what feels known and what feels comfortable and what feels essentially, right, like sort of sits within what you know, is so much easier. So one thing I'll say is like compassion, right? We need compassion. We need to bring men and those around men to have compassion and believe in and affirm those healthy aspirational ideas about manhood. And we have to understand that it's challenging work. And often the progressive side just assumes this argument is self-evident. Why don't they get it? It's so obvious, right? It's like, why aren't they understanding this? The other thing I'll say as a last point is that we often sort of, that we get asked this a lot. How do you engage men? How do you recruit men? How do you bring men into your programs? And a lot of research, including Michael Flood's work, et cetera, shows that getting men at transitional points in their life is actually the time in which they are most amenable to change. So when they're about to get married, when they're about to become a father, right? And so those kind of times, right, where we can then, exactly, Christine, what you were saying, we can then build on what roles they're already occupying, but then provide and show and create spaces for that healthier, more emotionally expressive, equitable, caring, non-violent type of masculinities is how we sort of do our grassroots work in different countries in the world. So I'll stop here and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Just a couple of small things I want to mention. Even though there seems to be a push by both people in the manosphere, but also people at the center of this discussion, to say, hey, masculinity isn't bad. And I don't think that any of us are saying that masculinity is bad. However, certain parts of masculinity are a huge risk factor to not only men's well-being. We have 50, 60 years of empirical research from demography, sociology, psychology, neuroscience, showing that the men who endorse these ideas of these particular features of masculinity, of dominance, providership, risk-taking, those men may have the highest purpose, as Tavishi is saying, but they're also the most likely to die of stress-related death, right? Which will not make it so they can provide for their families. They are more likely to abuse substances. They're more likely to abuse children and women around them. So this cannot be lost in the conversation that, yes, there are some positive human features that have been ascribed to masculine norms, right? There are times in life where we all need to be assertive. There are times where we all need to take risks. There are times we want to all protect the people we love. But when we're saying that this belongs to men and they must fulfill it, we cannot forget that these are incredibly risky ideologies to hold while keeping in mind all these other things. And on the the point about male role models, for a while, I've been keeping a note on my phone of positive male role models because I hear all the time people saying there are no role models for men. I think this is actually just a matter of which role models are visible and which role models are claiming to be involved in masculinity discourse. I think Keanu Reeves is a pretty good, a really kind, lovely person who also seems to embody other pieces of masculinity as we've been told it exists. He isn't going out there and saying, hey, men, you should be more like me. I think of, these aren't necessarily perfect figures, but The Rock, who is also very tender, Justin Baldoni, Andrew Scott, Stephen Yoon, Rami, Riz Ahmed, Loyal Carner, the rapper. There are these people out there. They may not be as loud and they may not be on the phone of an 11-year-old who's scrolling on TikTok, but we should not forget that these men exist. So I just wanted to add those points, that these role models are not something that we need to just totally create out of thin air. So I want to turn now to our amazing Q&A. Thank you for those who have submitted questions, and please continue to in our last 24 minutes. There's a lot for me to look through here. So I'm going to start here with Christopher's question. Christopher, thanks for joining us. He says, I coordinate groups for boys in middle school and high schools focused on social, emotional connection and growth. And I think that they provide a lot of benefit. Have you seen similar programs for teen boys that you like? Would you like to see more of them? Tavishi, that might be a great question to pose to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some fantastic SEL programs, and the one that I would sort of say which has actually been evaluated and scaled up is Roots of Empathy, and it exists in Canada. And it's just such a beautiful program that gets integrated into school curriculum. I don't think it's with teen boys, if I'm not mistaken. Forgive me on that one, but I would recommend that you look at that one first. And then Niobe Way just released a book called Rebels Without a Cause, and she talks about her listening project, where she did actually work with teen boys in New York City and neighboring cities and schools. And I would really recommend you read that as well to sort of see like what she did. And so those are a couple, and I'm sure, Angelica, we can sort of keep sending some more resources as well, but those two just come to the top of my mind right away.
Yeah, I don't have an organization name that comes to the top of my mind right away, but I also just wanted to follow up, Angelica, on what you were saying about, male role models and the ones that already exist in society. I think another thing that I have recognized in my reporting and talking to young men, and actually one of my interviewees told me this specifically when we were talking about, well, who taught you how to be a man? Like, who is teaching you what masculinity looks like? And he was like, like I do see friends who are like going for these like influencers and falling in line with these people. But honestly, the best examples of masculinity, I think, aren't the men shouting about how manly they are. Like the best masculinity influencers are usually not even identifiable as masculinity influencers, because what they're actually spending their time doing is going about their lives being good people who happen to be male, and then the young men and other men around them just like see them as people who they want to be like. And so, and he also mentioned, this young man I was speaking to was like, yeah, I don't want to necessarily like watch a man on TV. Like what I'm really looking for like is a figure in my community, who is sort of a one-to-one mentor figure for me, somebody who I can actually just like speak to and live with their example in life. And so I think this idea of sort of real mentors, like father figures, men in their own communities, being examples to the men around them, is perhaps the most powerful mode of change that we have right now. And so in thinking about programming that helps younger men especially, I think a lot of them would explicitly say, like, I just want a father figure who I can learn from, Because one of the things that I've found in my research, and that's visible in a lot of other research about masculinity, and even not even masculinity, but troubled boys or young people, is a distinct lack of either fathers in their lives or father figures in their lives, men who they can look up to and relate to. The work of Raj Chetty, showed most recently in his sort of opportunity insights that when you look at neighborhoods for social mobility, you can look at this block by block. Boys who come from blocks where there are not like older males in their neighborhood tend to not move forward economically, do not have a lot of social mobility. But on blocks where even if the men on the block are not the parents of sort of the men in homes, but at least there are just fathers around or older men around in the neighborhood that younger men can look up to, those boys tend to thrive and have a higher opportunity of sort of moving out of the spaces that they're in. And so just having visible on the ground relationships seems actually to be one of the key leverage points or key ways to affect outcomes moving forward, even more than having sort of like popular stars talking about masculinity.
Thank you so much, Christine. That's such an excellent point to bring into the room, and excellent work to bring into the room. We're also going to be collating all these resources to share to everyone who's in the call today, so that you can see all the work we've mentioned for yourself. I want to bring in Egan's question, and I want to pose that to you first, Tristan. Egan says, transgender people across time and cultures have successfully navigated without and in contradiction to gender norms available to them. What can men in crisis and the people who care about them, from parents to communities to nonprofits, learn from transgender experience to help with coping and transformation?
That's such a great question. I actually think often we can and we talked about this earlier on the call, that we can kind of learn a lot from the margins. And the interesting thing about trans folks who understand themselves to have some kind of relationship with masculinity is that they have often thought about it much more deliberately than have cisgender folks. And that means that they are experts of this in a way that cisgender folks are often not, because we've been socialized to kind of not think about these things. I think that we have a great deal to learn from trans men in thinking about how what they understand about masculinity. A friend and writer I really admire is Thomas Page McBee, who wrote this really amazing memoir. It's entitled Amateur. He was the first trans man to box in Madison Square Garden, and the memoir is about his sort of journey learning to fight. The way, I don't know if he would describe it this way, but the way I describe his book to others is sort of say, originally he undertook this project, I think, because he felt like learning to fight was part about being a man. And the book is about learning just how much that was not actually true. And if you read the memoir, you find that the coaches and other people who are sort of part of this journey, they learned a lot about masculinity too, being alongside him. So I don't know, trans and queer communities too, I think have a lot to teach us about just how we can organize society in different ways and achieve different forms of equality. So sometimes people create new definitions of family that can be really helpful, and they do so without the same notions of power and authority and hierarchy that are part of cultural traditions all over the world. And so I think we have a lot to learn from people who are creating new gendered ways of being. And that's a great place to start. It's a great question.
I want to bring in another question that was, I think, something we had planned to talk about, but I appreciate someone for bringing up. I apologize if I'm saying your name wrongly. Tejaswini asks, why is this crisis emerging at a time when women are slowly refusing to tolerate generations of trauma, passive aggression, and narcissism? Is the burden of emotional care labor once again falling primarily on women? And I think just an extension to this question is, why does the masculinity in crisis dialogue wax and wane at particular times in economic development, in human history and culture? Why might it reemerge at particular moments? Basically, what is the trajectory of gender vertigo in terms of predicting it, capitalizing on it, et cetera? Why now?
I can start that one. I would say that if there were a historian on this call, one thing that they would tell us is that definitions of masculinity have been shown to follow, so shifts in what it means to be a man have been shown by historians to follow shifts in what it means to be a woman. So we see shifts in femininity and then shifts in masculinity come after that. And that's like a historical pattern that's happened in lots of different societies. And it's weird and it's uncomfortable because I think we don't tend to think about groups and people in power as capable of being pushed around, but the historical record sort of suggests that masculinity is being pushed around by femininity. I think of this as a scholar of power and inequality, that like this is, this is what happens when power gets challenged, then it adapts and it transforms in new ways. And so I think that there's I actually don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard it said before where people say, when women gain power, men grow beards. That like when women gain power, like men do something to exaggerate gender difference or something like that. And so I think that this is precisely why it's coming up at this historical moment, that it feels like as we move toward equality, there's going to be a little bit of reactions to that in lots of different directions. And I think we see this every time. That's why the crisis of masculinity narrative is like historically recycled. It happens, I don't know, every 10 or 20 years. And maybe with the rise of social media and stuff, the one we're seeing now just has a bigger megaphone than it used to.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think your point about the bigger megaphone is a really important element, actually. I mean, speaking as someone in media, I think there are two things to really be aware of in this moment and also cautious of as we talk about the crisis of masculinity. One is that, yeah, this crisis of masculinity recurs. It is, in fact, in many ways, a reaction to change. In some ways, when the ideas of masculinity historically have been threatened by changes in femininity, by changes in material conditions, the first reaction is to sort of grasp masculinity or grasp the idea even more tightly, and try and regrow it somehow. So that's definitely happening. But I think it is perhaps, blown to new proportions in this specific moment because there is real profitability to be had in creating this narrative of crisis and exploiting it. I mean, again, if you think about our political system right now, our political priorities, the sort of combating narratives, there is real sort of money to be made and votes to be gotten, and conversation to be forced by, one side of the spectrum claiming that masculinity is in crisis, claiming that men will lose out and be harmed unless they vote for this party or unless they are supportive of this political candidate. So blowing up the idea of like, it's not just a crisis, it's the worst crisis of all time, can be really profitable for, frankly, conflict profiteers. And not just sort of like political conflict profiteers, but also just sort of media profiteers. I mean, again, we've talked about some of these masculinity influencers, whether it's, Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson, or this just like incredible profusion of podcasters on relationships who are selling courses teaching men how to be alphas instead of betas. The best way to sell a course to men about how to be an alpha instead of a beta is to tell them that they're very much at risk of being a beta because there's a crisis of masculinity and they need to respond to it. And in a social media environment too, that unfortunately, privileges and recirculates negative content and fear-based content because it, it causes more reactions. It is profitable for them. Negative and frightening and alarming messages about how you're in crisis, how your life is about to fall apart, how something is going wrong are good on social media. Narratives about a crisis of masculinity that has to be fixed immediately, that's the worst it's ever been, just will spread incredibly fast, and will go incredibly far and gain traction in really intense ways. And so I think we're definitely on a very basic level, just at a moment of flux where, the concept is being challenged and we all are having to reconsider it. But there are other elements about sort of the markets we're in, the space we're in, that are really helping it to be blown out of proportion, and make it attractive for that to happen.
There's one element of Tejaswini's question around is the burden of care and emotional labor falling back on women? And I just want to highlight that a little bit to say that's the one piece where emerging data in OECD countries, certainly in the United States, is actually showing that more men than ever before are doing more child caregiving work than they have done in the past. And so, we're also expanding the definition of caregiving, because we often look at men only as caregivers when they become fathers, when in fact they are caregivers all their lives to their spouse, to their parents, to their communities, neighbors, even the planet. And in this time of climate catastrophes, we really do need to recognize how we need to sort of center care. But at the same time, when it comes to emotional labor, as you're calling it, the data in a lot of the sort of global north, but some of the OECD countries are showing that men are much more likely than any of their past generations put in more care work than they have in the past.
Thank you to all of you for those points. I think they just come together so beautifully. And I want to offer just a personal anecdote that I think responds directly to this question. When I think about how masculinity is changing also in relation to what women are allowed to expect, I think of my own grandmother who called her parents when she was being domestically abused and said, "This is what's happening to me." And they said, "Well, is there a roof over your head and is there food on the table?" Right? You're not allowed to dream of men beyond this particular role. My mother, who I think is on this call, that was not in her expectation of men, that her spouse would be able to physically abuse her and rule by fear and force. But some of those emotional capacities of deep vulnerability and emotional intelligence weren't something that my mother's generation could expect from their spouses. Now look one generation further, and the vision of true partnership that I hope to have in my life is wildly generations different from what my grandmother could expect. So these changes are also in relation to what women are allowed to dream of and tolerate. So this question that you asked is so welcome. And I want to finish by zooming back out to the structural. This excellent question, Taharka, thank you for asking it. They say, in many discussions I hear about masculinity, they begin with very nuanced discussions about personal beliefs, as well as the structural and ecological factors that influence men and boys' behavior. But unfortunately, by the end of these discussions, the solutions or interventions focusing on the solutions and interventions are focused on reforming harmful masculine beliefs, but not challenging structural inequalities that marginalize groups of men, especially Black and brown men. How should this be critiqued and engaged? So I think it's really important to bring out the actual structure that this all sits within of why these problems exist in the first place. So thank you for that question. And whoever wants to engage with it first, please.
I can just start, and then I know that Tristan and Christine would be able to add more nuance to it. It is a really good question, because I think that we also fell into that trap a little bit of sort of talking about reforming norms and changing, individual kind of pathways and trajectories. So there's a couple of things I think let me just see your question again, because I think you're asking, how should we sort of think about challenging structural inequalities? And a lot of what was talked about today, for example, was the labor force market, right? Like what is happening with men and the ways in which they're experiencing like economic precarity, right? Where they're sort of thinking about, we did the study too, like generations, their grandfathers could afford houses and, you know, and they are not being able to do the same thing in their day and in their sort of lifetime. So why is that? So there's things like unemployment, there's things like inflation, there's things like, you know, continuous sort of the gender pay gap is reducing. There's more male dominated CEOs, but fortunately also we're having way more political participation by women. We might be able to sort of think about having more CEO women down the road. So how do we think about these structural changes? How do we bring in the multiple systems in which men and women inhabit? So workplaces, school systems, etc., health sector, where we can think about removing some of these inequalities. And when you bring in ethnic inequalities, particularly in the US, and Christine, I think you will be able to speak more of that, the work that needs to be done is so much more, because I think we know for a fact, particularly in the US, but also in other countries with high immigration, right? All the outcomes we've listed, Black, Brown, Latino, I mean, all the ethnicities and races, they are sort of far behind than any majority ethnic group. So yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer as such. We do talk a lot about policy changes. We do talk a lot about, you know, sort of shifting and thinking about paid parental leave. That's something the US, for example, doesn't have. It's one of the only industrialized countries in the world that doesn't have paid maternity mandated and paternal leave. It was something that I know that the politicians were trying to come and pass a year or two ago, and it didn't actually make it. I remain hopeful that let's see what happens with the next round of elections. But to say that those are the kind of structural differences, those are the kind of structural solutions that can filter down to individual level. We know paid parental leave, for example, trickles down to men being better caregivers, their spouses recovering faster from childbirth, going back to work faster, having better mental, physical health, not just for their family, but themselves as well. So yeah, just to sort of say that there are so many ways in which we can structurally change that. We have to change the workplace environment too. It's not just about providing leave. Can a culture be created where then paid leave is encouraged? It's not discouraged. Can the co-worker step in and say, I'm not going to penalize my colleague who's taken paid leave? So again, so many ways in which we can address these issues. Christine.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's perfect. And actually paid leave was an example that I was going to bring up too. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I mean, not only would say changes in paid leave, you know, sort of materially and structurally help men, that is also how we change norms. Having, you know, paid maternal and paternal leave would also begin to normalize the idea that men can care for their families, that it is in fact a normal and expected thing to do. That is a major norm shift that you know, a structural change could make. But I mean, I think, Daharka, what you're saying about the structural inequalities that marginalize groups of men, that we need to change those, you know, kind of expeditiously, perhaps instead of just focusing on beliefs, is really key, because I do often think that the belief or the feeling follows the structural and material reality on the ground. One of the things about sort of this crisis of masculinity framing and the way that certain men, that a lot of men feel like they're in a crisis is, you know, I think I used this term like way earlier in our conversation, this zero-sum idea, right? That if women win something, they're taking it from men, and men will not have anything left, that there is a very finite amount of resources available in our political system, in our country, and the crisis is that women are taking it all and men are left with less. And I think the focusing on sort of the structural inequalities that make it feel as though there are not enough resources to go around in our incredibly resource rich country would do so much to lower the temperature. and the zero-sum feeling that we see in marginalized groups, especially, but among, gender to gender overall. So yeah, that would look like things like making it easier to buy homes so that men don't feel, threatened by their inability to afford what they see as their goals, and then, blame it on the opposite gender or someone else. We talked about labor market shifts and how certain jobs are, no longer extant in the United States, or if they are, paying way less than they used to. So a solution that might actually help, men feel more confident in their own worth as citizens and participants in the United States would be to invest in new modes of workforce support, new routes for working in different industries, whether that's an increase in vocational training, whether that is paths to, these sort of healthcare, et cetera, and other jobs that are becoming a bigger part of our economy. And again, normalizing that for men so that there is less of this feeling of there is nothing for me, people are taking away my resources, thus I'm going to be in conflict. I think so many of just our issues in this moment are the result of a pervasive feeling of inequality, especially economic inequality, that simply pits people against each other. Men against women who feel like something is being taken from them, minority groups especially who feel like they're being extra marginalized in this particular moment because there's not enough to go around, and a sort of emphasis on abundance and structural policy that allows for this abundance so that people don't feel as much as at risk. And this is for men certainly, but for almost any group of people in the United States would go an enormous way toward lessening this idea of crisis.
Thank you, Christine. And unfortunately, we are out of time, but I think this is a really beautiful note to end it on. There's so much, this has been so rich. It's been such a rich discussion. And the conversation is ongoing. Thank you so much to our three panelists for offering your wisdom, your experience, and just your brilliance with us. And I want to also thank the audience. I'm seeing names of people who I know are in this space and doing this work in this Q&A and on our list of participants. And so thank you to everyone who is, this conversation extends so far beyond this panel, but thank you for those of you who are doing this work and are committed to this really, really urgent issue. And then finally, thank you to the Clayman Institute for making discussions like this possible. It is such essential work and we are deeply grateful. So thank you to everyone who joined us. Email coming to share resources, and take care.